I wanted to get into the Russian scare, the segment I like to call this segment of the show, The Russians Are Coming, because, I'm probably the only one old enough on this show to remember actually ducking and covering in elementary school. Seriously, I mean, and those fallout shelter signs. So interestingly enough, in 11th grade U.S. history, I wrote a paper on the revisionist theory of the Cold War. So I'm very familiar with who really started the Cold War. And when I saw Oliver Stone's excellent series, The Untold History of the United States, this summer, I watched it with my 19-year-old son. I learned more about Harry Truman and how if Henry Wallace had won the election to be vice president in Roosevelt's fourth term, things might have turned out very different. Henry Wallace was the Bernie Sanders of his day. And what happened was he was all set to win that vice presidential contest. And then they pulled a fire alarm in the convention center so that they could get more votes for Harry Truman. So, you talk about a contested convention. And the next day they all walked in and they had the votes lined up, and Harry Truman, who was a pawn of Allen Dulles and the head of the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles, the banker. So it's the start of the military industrial Wall Street complex, otherwise known as the deep state. They thought that he would be a pawn, and sure enough, when he came into office, he broke all of Roosevelt's agreements with Stalin that were made at Yalta. And Stalin, he obviously did some horrible things. No one's defending him, just like we're not defending Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and Assad. But, these people, we sure like them when they're on our side fighting our common enemy. And we really needed Russia to defeat the Nazis in World War II. So all they were really looking for was a sphere of influence. And we fomented this whole thing about the Russians are trying to rule the world and the whole domino theory. And then of course that led to Vietnam, and the rest is history. So it's very interesting for me to watch, not that I was understanding of this as in elementary school, but it's very interesting for me to watch this happening. It's like deja vu all over again. And, we see it happening with this election right now because they are using this, and a lot of liberals and progressives, and I make the distinction between liberals and progressives, by the way, because Rachel Maddow continues to call herself a liberal. She'll never call herself a progressive, are just uncritically repeating all of these allegations about the Russians hacking into our election and interfering with our elections for the purpose of electing Donald Trump. And to me, this is the biggest fake news story of the moment. Every single news outlet is promulgating this. Every single liberal, nonprofit is promulgating this. Even activist groups like, 99 Rise, now called Democracy Spring, are planning this thing on Monday, tomorrow, where everybody's supposed to go to their state capitals to protest this election, to try to influence the electors. So this is a very major thing. And I'd like to know people's thoughts about this, because Glenn Greenwald and Robert Perry, who are two investigative journalists who I respect a lot, have really questioned this thing as to whether even the Russians did hack into our elections. So I'm just going to open it up, whoever wants to jump in.
Well, if I could, there are good reasons to believe that Russia did it, but the problem is that we haven't definitively shown that they did it. It's not, it isn't, I'm hesitant to call it fake news so much as I would call it unproven speculation. And circumstantial evidence just isn't enough. Our intelligence has been wrong before. We've made disastrous decisions based on faulty intelligence before. So with that in mind, the standard cannot be relying on anonymous sources inside these intelligence agencies. There are reasons to be skeptical. The speed at which the intelligence community arrived at the conclusion that it was Russia is problematic. the idea that we just have to kind of lockstep and go off and start saying, well, Russia's the problem, and oh, by the way, Donald Trump is in on it. That's the real, to me, that's the really offensive part. There's no evidence that Donald Trump was, even if it was Russia, that he was in on it. So, you know, I think that, yeah. Sorry?
Completely related to that, because you sparked the thought. It's like not only Donald Trump, but now it's Putin he personally intervened. He was actually helping sort through the emails. He was, you know, involved in the strategy with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks on release of these emails. That's the story that NBC News broke this week. And you know, that now they're, not only did they break the story, which ran online, NBCnews.com, but one of the reporters on one of the 3 reporters on that byline is now being interviewed like every hour on MSNBC. And every time he's interviewed, he's not only talking about what was in the article, but he's also coming up with new theories about, you know, why. You know, yesterday I saw him on MSNBC, and he said, well, you know, what he was asked, why don't we have any like more definitive proof than just anonymous sourcing? And he says, well, it's a good thing that we don't have this. And by the way, these people are patriots and they love their country and they would never do it politically. Why is a reporter for NBC News saying that it's a good thing that we don't know anything about the sourcing and methodology of the sources who were the key sources for his story? And why is he also then going and saying, oh, and by the way, they're patriotic, they love their country, and it's not? Look, how does he know any of these things? And what right does he have to go on every hour on MSNBC and say these sorts of things? And why isn't being called under question more heavily? That's what's been really bothering me recently.
Well, let me ask you this, because, you know, Julian Assange has said it's not the Russians, and the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, has said that he received the email data from disgusted Democrats in a Washington, D.C. park. Now, Glenn Greenwald seems to think that Assange has gone off the deep end. So I don't know, I guess there's a little internal stuff there. But these former intelligence people who call themselves Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPs, which include William Binney, former technical director, a world GOP political and military analyst, NSA, Mike Gravel, who's a former adjutant, top secret control officer, communications intelligence service, Larry Johnson, former CIA intelligence officer and former State Department counterterrorism official, Ray McGovern, who we remember from Iraq, challenging that intelligence, former U.S. Army infantry intelligence officer and CIA analyst, et cetera, et cetera. And they are basically saying that it is circumstantial evidence. And why would they rely on circumstantial evidence when they have hard evidence? They are classifying these email disclosures as a leak, not a hack. And they said if it is hacking, the NSA would know it, because they would know, and they get into the technical description, which I'm not going to bore you with. They would know both the sender and the recipient. And they say in their article in Consortium News that evidence could be brought forward without damage to their sources or the methods. So they conclude that the leak was by insiders in the Democratic Party that were just disgusted with what they were doing to Bernie Sanders. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I'm a little, look, I'm skeptical of these kinds of theories, because look, it would certainly be a wonderful story if this all turned out to be leaks from within, and that it wasn't Russia, and that there was this real agenda, more than I think just getting clicks and likes and shares. I think that until we have the evidence that's necessary to link these hacker groups, or these groups that are claimed to have hacked the emails and the DNC, until we see that evidence of them being linked to Russia's government, we should treat that with skepticism. But we should also treat the reports of a handful of intelligence experts with skepticism as well, the same amount, if not more. We have to remember that there is general consensus among these agencies, private and public. So that to me does say something, and to ignore it, I think, would be a mistake. That's not to say we just fall in line and accept it, but that's just my take on this.
Yeah, my take. Oh, I'll be really quick. Sorry. Just the one thing. There's like a really decent piece of evidence here that shows that it wasn't really hacking as much as sort of as a version of hacking, phishing, phishing, in which John Podesta was sent like a fake link saying, "Hey, you have a security breach. You need to click this." And I think that that's a good piece of evidence that it probably wasn't a whistleblower. Is that he was tricked by this, and that is what really fell his emails to whoever, whatever operation sent that particular link. So I have a hard time believing that it was just a kind of leaker. I think that it was definitely some kind of sophisticated breach.
Lily, you were going to say something?
I was just going to reiterate the point that we were talking about this earlier as a group, that just because a hack or a phishing scam originates from a member or a group of a certain country does not necessarily follow that the government of that country is behind it all. And Brazil is another hub for hackers. And I'm wondering if this phishing scam that John Podesta fell for, which, by the way, if that's being hacked, that's kind of calling like leaving the doors to your car open and someone opens the door and takes the wallet off the seat, like a break-in. Is it really? I mean, his password was also laughable. So that's another conversation about, security and the care that people are taking with these, state documents. But anyway, like Walker said, we haven't seen a connection yet to Moscow other than what the news media has generated. It went from, it might have been Russians to it was definitely Russians to it was Putin to it was Trump and Putin, over breakfast at a cafe deciding to do this together is basically where the narrative has gone. So that's where I find the most concern is that, how are we using the nationalities of these, this world information to guide and push our war interests, essentially?
Yeah, we're going to have to end this segment in a few minutes to bring in Bob Fitrakis, who I hope we can get in this week. We had trouble getting him in last week. So I wanted to just ask Caitlin and John if you had any last words you wanted to say about fake news and the Russians are coming before we sign off with you guys.
I got some.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to talk about the accusations of Russian involvement and all that. And so I think it's, as some people on the show have already said, it's important to point out that so much of like the so-called evidence rests on kind of anonymous intelligence officials like informing these publications, which have been very irresponsible lately. But I think we need to like put this in context. So what we know is we have our government, intelligence officials telling us like, oh, it was Russia, it was Putin, and all this, and then on the other side, we've heard Putin and Russian spokespeople say, no, that's poppycock, we didn't do that. So we have two different people like claiming things, and like let's look back at the history of the U.S. and the Cold War, as I'm sure Lauren, you said you wrote a paper on the revisionist history, and also at U.S. intelligence operations, for the last 50 years, we had like COINTELPRO, so we have a government that has a history of lying to us, that's proven, and they're telling us one thing. I'm not saying they're lying right now, but I'm saying that they're not furnishing us with any evidence, and that it's this kind of almost defensively kind of condescending paternalistic attitude for them to just be like, well, we have evidence, you children wouldn't understand, we're not going to release anything, we're not going to show you anything. I mean, if they really had evidence that Russia, I'm like, why not release that? Why not show us? Why not show the world? Show American journalists? You know, show everyone proof. And then if they do have proof, then you know, Putin and his spokespeople say, no, we didn't do it. You know, and we're looking at proof. Then, you know, then that'll be something. You know, and I'd be willing to look at that and examine that and be like, oh, damn it, you know, they did. The Russians did hack us. And you know, I'll be the first person to acknowledge that, but so far, like, I haven't seen anything empirical other than just you should believe US officials and don't believe Russian officials, because the US government is trustworthy and Russian government, you know, lies, and just believe us about that. And no, like, I mean, it's irresponsible for journalists, it's irresponsible for the public to, yeah, that's my rant.
I think also it's important to have a look where the belief leads us. Whether, you know, if we don't have evidence, hard evidence on either side, but we do have a choice on who we believe. If we believe the CIA, then we go pretty much to war with Russia. If we believe Assange, then we're basically left with having like the painful look at the internal workings of the democracy and what needs to be done about it. It's a choice between blaming and forgetting that the embarrassing problems were revealed in the first place, or actually taking a step back and going, all right, no, this revealed something very wrong and very broken, and it needs to be fixed. So personally, like if I find myself in that situation where I have those two choices, I do look generally to fixing rather than fighting someone. So that would be where I would choose.
Okay, great, thanks. You know, we're gonna wrap up this segment. I wanna ask John, if you don't mind hanging up, because we wanna try to see if we can get Bob Fitrakis in. And since you've been on since the beginning, I wanna thank you so much, and we hope we can have you on again. And we look forward to reading more of your writing at www.johnlaurits.com.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're gonna chat a little bit more while Bob Fitrakis tries to get into our hangout. Steve, you have any thoughts?
Oh man, I like what you said at the beginning. Just to root this in history is extremely important. It's sort of been discussed, but I came from, before I moved, I was living in Madison, Wisconsin. That was actually the hub of the Wisconsin School for Diplomatic History, which was this revisionist history of the Cold War and basically of U.S. history in general, of how the United States, like, contrary to the popular discourse, the United States has long been an imperial country. Here's what they've done. This Cold War that exists right now with Russia, there's a context to it. I think that it's just extremely important. The other thing is just in general, look at the history of the CIA, and it's very difficult once you look at that history to consider them sort of the vanguard of truth on basically anything. So I mean, I think that in general, for this situation, we should have skepticism towards any sort of dogma and really just be, independently as individuals, be hunting for the truth. Don't take any single claim as any sort of God's word on this issue.
Still waiting for Bob Fitrakis. Walker, thoughts?
Well, you know, I mean, I think I treat it with a healthy level of skepticism. I think that I look at some of there was an Esquire article that made a bunch of circumstantial connections, which I thought warranted a second look. There's definitely cause for investigation. But if the big concern is foreign influence in our elections, this is not really where we should be focusing. In my opinion, we should really look at campaign finance reform, because after Citizens United, all a foreign country really has to do to influence our election is set up a dummy corporation and have a subsidiary here in the US. That subsidiary can be a 501c4, which means it doesn't have to reveal its donors. It can then set up a super PAC, which can basically act as a shadow campaign. And it can hire lobbyists. It has all the speech rights as a U.S. citizen under the standards set by Buckley versus Vallejo, which means you can spend unlimited sums of money on politics. And it's basically untraceable. So Saudi Arabia, Israel, South Sudan, Iraq, all of these countries actively lobby in the U.S. They influence our elections. And we don't know how extensive their networks are. That, to me, undermines our democracy far more than Russia hacking into the Democratic National Committee's emails or the Clinton campaign's emails and revealing what's going on internally.
I'm talking with Bob right now, so carry on, guys.
Well, I was wondering, Hunter, could you talk about your experience with you had with doing the story, Kurt Eichenwald, and situation with the blow up, and he's been in the news this week because of the blow up he had on Fox News on Tucker Carlson's show, but you had your own experience there. Maybe people would be interested.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I actually, nobody's going to believe me when I say this, but I actually think Kurt Eichenwald is a nice person underneath everything. I also think that he is probably a very poor journalist at this point. And the reason that I say that is because he wrote a story back in, when is this story from? I have it pulled up on my screen here. He wrote this story back in October, on October 10th. What had happened was a writer for Sputnik had found a tweet online that said Sidney Blumenthal said this damning thing about Benghazi, that it's legitimate fodder for the Republicans. Sidney Blumenthal had taken a Kurt Eichenwald article that said that and sent it to Podesta, and it got leaked. And this person on Twitter had found it and tweeted it out. The Sputnik journalist, who was the only person working in the office that day, his name was Bill Moran. He took that tweet and he didn't do his proper vetting, and he wrote an article about it. 20 minutes later, he reconsidered after nobody else had picked up on it, and he went back and he realized his mistake and he took it down. But Donald Trump happened to use that quote that was misattributed to Blumenthal from Eichenwald, and said Sidney Blumenthal even thinks Clinton is to blame on Benghazi and blah blah blah. So Eichenwald finds this and does this whole thing: "Dear Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, I'm not Sidney Blumenthal." And Moran gets fired from Sputnik. Now, we can agree, I think, that would be a fireable offense if you write a story that is incorrect and you don't fact check, and then it gets tweeted out or mentioned in a speech by a presidential candidate and becomes a viral thing. You're going to get fired for that. So Moran gets fired. He reaches out to Eichenwald over Twitter and says, like, "Look, I'm coming forward to own my mistake. Please update your article or take it down." Eichenwald then blocks him. And so he sends Newsweek a cease and desist letter, at which point Eichenwald reaches out and says, "Look, you're anonymous. I don't mention you by name in the article. So essentially keep quiet and I will help you get a job at New Republic. But if you'd rather go forward, I'll put this paragraph that names you and says you're a bad journalist in my article, and you'll never get another job again." Moran actually does decide to go for the latter option. And so Eichenwald writes, "William Moran, the writer for Sputnik, said he based his article not on directives from the Russian government, but on an anonymous tweet he saw on the internet. that used an altered image of the document. When he says altered, by the way, he doesn't actually mean altered. He means take a little snippet of it and put it up, like a little clip of it. So it's not actually an alteration. It's Anyway, he said he accepted the anonymous tweeter's description of this from Blumenthal, that this was from Blumenthal, and did so because he was rushed. However, as the government official with knowledge of the intelligence inquiry said, the original altered document was tweeted onto the internet that came from a location that has been identified as being connected to the Russian disinformation campaigns, and only the news outlet from the Russian government published an article based on it. Eichenwald never names his sources. This isn't the first time he would have maybe misled us on a source. He did another article recently about Bernie Sanders and how he might not have won because the Republicans had a book. He said it was a 2-foot thick folder on Bernie Sanders of claims that didn't get out during the primary. And then, of course, all of those claims were released during the primary. Everything that was supposedly this secret file on Sanders was actually public information that had been reported by various different agencies. And I did an article on that as well. But look, Eichenwald is your quintessential fake news journalist. And Newsweek has just not controlled it at all. Jim Impoko, the editor-in-chief, has stood by him every step of the way. Because look, he gets clicks, he gets likes, he has over 200,000 followers on Facebook, Twitter. He is on all of the major shows and networks. But when you look at his stories and you boil them down, there's very little substance there. And so I think Eichenwald is a little delusional. And I've spent over an hour on the phone with him, so that's just my take.
Yeah.
Well, this as background though. The story that you're talking about that he did, it got shared a lot on social media. Like that's why you wrote about it, right? I mean, that was like it went super viral after he wrote that, and that was like a way that article was actually used as a different fake news story. That is that. Hey, look, like these emails that are on WikiLeaks, however they were obtained, regardless of that, these emails a lot of them are doctored, right? These are not even authentic. That was like its own kind of fake news story that did appear with no evidence, is that the emails were themselves not authentic, and so we shouldn't trust them. And that became a story, but there was no grounding during the month of October before the election.
Yeah, no, he keeps using the word altered throughout his writing, and that's problematic. And my editor actually pointed that out to him, and he said, no, altered doesn't necessarily mean forged. It just means that they could have taken a little segment of it, and that's altering it because it's not showing the whole thing. It's very misleading. Eichenwald is really a propagandist. He was a Clinton supporter, diehard Clinton supporter. He wrote a story about how Bernie Sanders supporters were bullies and were violent and out of control during the primaries. It's frustrating because he's really abusing his authority. And this story, as you said, it was viral. It got out. It refuses to die. Keith Olbermann has cited it in several of his video segments. He's somebody else who I think is kind of losing his mind. But no, it's true though. I mean, you watch it. His picture on Twitter is him wrapped in an American flag, like a victim of like a house fire. It's embarrassing.
Yeah. That is the problem, though, isn't it? When a source like that has the Newsweek behind them comes out and says something, it doesn't matter how ludicrous it is or how badly sourced it is. That immediately becomes the credibility of which other journalists write their stories from. So that's the sort of fake news that can really mislead and take a whole nation down a wrong path, like the weapons of mass destruction, which is another great example of where insinuation. No one actually said Saddam Hussein and 9/11 happened together, but at some point, I think it was in 2003, 70% of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein had personally was the bomber of 9/11. So and that's why the Iraq War, how they manufacture consent into doing heinous things overseas, killing people, en masse. And that's what concerns me so much about this, the CIA's point of view on and what the story that they're trying to push. Because if it does take us into a war with Russia, that's a huge thing to go in on, on some circumstantial evidence. That's to throw a world into war on some hearsay is quite a big thing to do.
Right. That's the risk. It's not that we progressives are shutting down this idea that Russia did it and definitively saying no, Russia did not do it. It's that the bar of for the proof before we take action against Russia, a nuclear power, has to be higher than a lot of these Clinton Democrats seem to think that it seem to place it at.
Right. It has to be more than hearsay at this point in time. And I think the world is going to demand more than just hearsay again. America has kind of maybe used up its trust bank a little bit in the last 15 years on saying, well, this is what's happening and we know what's happening, and so come and do this thing with us. I think there's going to be more questions asked from an international audience as well, if that's to be the case. If that's going to be the push for war, then there's going to be more demand for more evidence, I believe.
Okay, we've got Bob Fitrakis in the Hangout, so I want to just say goodbye to all my guests. Caitlin Johnstone from Newslog. Steve, you're sticking with us, and Walker Bragman, who writes a lot on Paste. Where else can we see your writing, Walker? I have some older pieces on Salon. Right now I'm writing a lot for Paste. I have another article that I've been shopping around on foreign influence in our elections, so we'll see. Just stick with me, follow me on Twitter, and yeah. And thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful. Okay. So I think I have a video here that we're going to outro this segment with before we get into Bob Fitrakis. If Dave can play it. It's relative to what was just talked about, Kurt Eichenwald, who's really kind of come unglued. And it was an interview that I saw. It was like about a 9-minute interview with Tucker Carlson on Fox News yesterday. And someone already made a highlights reel and posted it on Facebook. It's about 1.5 minutes.
Was he in a mental hospital or not in 1990? You allege that he was. Was he or wasn't he? He wasn't.
I mean, Tucker, if you don't want me to answer the question, but I would like to answer the question, but I would really like to answer your question. Would you like me to answer the question or not? Or if you won't let me answer the question. Do you want me to answer the question or not? Let me answer the question. You're not letting me answer the question. I am trying to answer the question.
This is a little nutty.
So look how much time we are wasting with me trying to say, let me answer your question. Or you can let me answer your question.
Maybe coming undone. How about this? I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer. Do you have evidence that he was institutionalized in a mental hospital in 1990?
Still on
30 seconds.
Now, that's because you won't let me answer your questions. I don't think anybody's fooled. Okay, I will say this, because it's a message I've got from people from the CIA.
I'm starting to have concerns about you, Kurt.
Right now,
tell me what the secret message from the CIA is.